Ben kendim nasıl çalışabilirim daha sürdürülebilir bir gelecek için?
Paris Jolobayo-Chukti-Ki.
Mikä on pienenevän mehiläispopulaation vaikutus
Waarom
maapallon
zouden we ons
ekosysteemiin?
klimaatverandering moeten geven?
循環型社会ってどういう
Quel
仕組み
est pied? Manger du soja non durable ou manger
Plastic
du
straws,
viande
whole
locale?
bag, pavitaan o karime, परिसरයට කොතරම්
هل لأفعالنا البسيطة قيمة؟
जब बर्फानी तोदे सब पिघल जाएंगे तो बर्फानी रीछों
Welche
का क्या
Art von
मसला
Auswirkungen hat Palmöl?
Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to 4600 Kilometers of Sustainability, a podcast where we, Misha and Sonja, bring sustainability information to you in an easily digestible and hopefully entertaining form as we hang out together, but 4600 kilometers away from each other.
We know that there is a lot of audio entertainment out there, so we are super duper glad that you chose to hang out with us today. This is an episode about biodiversity, which is a topic that quite a few of our family and friends had questions about in the beginning of this project. Thank you very much for asking them.
We will have to divide this topic into 2 episodes because there's quite much to be said about it. In this episode, we discuss the basics of biodiversity in a broader sense, like what does it mean and why does it matter, and of course, how to protect it. We will also talk about some surprising impacts that biodiversity loss can bring about.
In the next episode, we will go into more details and discuss polar bears, bees, and whales specifically.
So let's get into the episode and talk about biodiversity and what it is exactly.
So the word biodiversity is a shortened word from the words biological and diversity. The term biodiversity refers to all the different types of life, such as plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms that can be found on Earth, and also the communities that they form and the habitats in which they live.
To add to it, biodiversity is actually a bit more complex term than just how many different kinds of creatures there are. Generally, we talk about 3 different types of biodiversity. So biodiversity of an area can be seen as the variety of different species, for example, animals or plants that live in a place. This is called species diversity.
Then we can also refer to the genetic diversity of an area, which can be explained as the difference between individuals of the same species. For example, you have different sizes of the same animal or different colors of a certain plant.
And then lastly, there's ecosystems diversity, meaning that you have different ecosystems on a certain area. Maybe you can find a forest where there's also a swamp and a river, and all those are their own ecosystems.
Interestingly, the higher the biodiversity of an area, the greater the benefit we can derive from it. This is because the biodiversity provides us with this thing called ecosystem services, and these are the benefits provided to us humans by the ecosystem. Shout out to Mother Earth.
We definitely cannot thank you enough. The services provided by ecosystem are countless, but we would like to mention a few. In general, we talk about 4 types of ecosystem services.
So when we talk about provisioning services, we talk about what nature gives to us, such as food, water, timber, and fiber.
We also have regulating services, which are kind of how nature takes care of our environment. These are the things like regulation of climate, floods, diseases, water quality, and waste treatment.
Then we have cultural services that are related to how we humans experience nature. These include recreation, like going for a run in a forest or going canoeing, aesthetic enjoyment, and spiritual fulfillment, like sacred natural places.
And the final ones are supporting services that are related to how nature supports and takes care of itself, such as through soil formation, pollination, and nutrient cycling.
To elaborate on these examples, I will talk about one of the many ecosystem services provided to us by trees. So Misha, on a hot sunny day while walking outdoors, what is the first thing you do?
Well, I look frantically for a walkway with tree cover so I can peacefully walk without sweating like a pig. Ha ha ha.
Exactly. Trees provide us with instant coolness, and you would have probably even noticed that an area with more tree cover is always cooler than the one with less tree cover. This is not only related to the shadow they provide us, but also just inherent property of plants. It's just like sitting on grass feels cooler than sitting on asphalt or stone surface. Trees act as coolants, and this is an example of how ecosystems regulate climate.
That is very true, but the sad reality is that human activities are causing major changes in communities of living things worldwide. And these changes can and are also already harming biodiversity and how well the ecosystems function.
This is all very alarming because the functioning of ecosystems is important for supporting plant and animal communities and ensuring the long-term survival of us. Because many of the ecosystem services are something we cannot live without, like food and clean water, and the rest are also just nice to have. Of course, ecosystem services are a very human way to look at nature, and we must appreciate also the intrinsic value of nature and not just what it gives to us. But yeah, Misha, could you tell us about what exactly is it that we're doing that damages biodiversity?
Basically, we often talk about 5 ways that destroy biodiversity. These are climate change, habitat destruction and fragmentation, overexploitation, pollution, and invasive species.
So climate change damages biodiversity because organisms are adjusted to certain climates through evolution and cannot survive when climate change is too much. Some animals can of course move to cooler regions, at least to certain limits, but plants cannot move just like that, and they might just die when it gets too hot.
Then we have habitat loss, meaning that we destroy or change the environment so that the organisms cannot live there anymore. For example, when we turn a rainforest to a farmland. Habitat fragmentation is also very damaging, so it is way worse to have many small forests than one big one. This is because many animals like to move around and stay far away from humans, and also because they need to be able to move so they can reproduce with animals in different populations so their genetics stay more diverse.
Also, overexploitation damages biodiversity, which means that if we harvest a certain tree or hunt a certain animal to extinction, it will, well, go extinct.
Pollution is also a major threat to biodiversity because the humans release a lot of stuff to the environment that is toxic to living things. Pollution can be anything from microplastics to heavy metals to agricultural fertilizers, etc. And finally, we have invasive species that we humans introduce to places they don't belong to. They can destroy the local wildlife through competition or predation. And if a new plant outcompetes an old plant, the species that ate the old plant will also suffer.
With everything we do to the environment, we are going to experience a major biodiversity crisis, which is basically going to result in the rapid loss of species and the rapid degradation of ecosystems. The world is losing species at a rate that is from 100 to 1,000 times faster than the natural extinction rate.
So a lot of people say that, oh, mass extinction of species have already occurred 5 times previously in the history of the world, and that it is no big deal. So reply to those people is that previous periods of mass extinction and ecosystems changes were driven by natural processes of global changes in climate and in atmospheric chemistry, impacts by asteroids and volcanism.
However, the case is very different now. We are in the 6th mass extinction event, which is a result of a competition for resources between one species on the planet, which is us humans, and all others.
There are also some very concrete examples of how biodiversity takes care of us humans, and we would like to discuss those a little bit.
For example, the currently ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has been connected to biodiversity loss. So apparently, the habitat loss that bats have experienced has forced them to live closer together, even if they're different bat species. This has caused them to transmit viruses to each other. In addition to that, they have been forced to live closer to humans as the natural areas are getting smaller and smaller. And yes, we know that it's unsure which animals actually transmitted the virus to us humans, but there is still a related strain of coronavirus that can be found in bats.
In general, the connection between biodiversity and the transmission of pathogens have been studied, and often, but not always, biodiversity loss has caused increased pathogen transmission.
Biodiversity also forms a delicate net in our ecosystem here on Earth, and when one of the components is lost, the whole system may change drastically. A very, very classic example are the wolves of the Yellowstone National Parks.
So the story starts from the early days of the national park, where they purposefully killed off the wolves as part of the management.
As you do. Wait, what?
This removal of one species totally messed up the natural order in the national park, and the ecosystem went through some drastic changes over the years. This was because the elk that used to be hunted by the wolves was able to reproduce freely and roam free wherever they wanted and kept eating the vegetation, such as tree saplings, thus harming many other species who relied on that vegetation.
The effects went on and on as a complicated chain reaction. For example, when there were no trees, there could be no beavers to build their dams with those trees. When the beavers could not build their dams, this harmed some of the fish species who really need the ponds created by beaver dams. When the fish suffered, this damaged the bears who would eat the fish.
When the wolves were decades later introduced back to Yellowstone, even the physical shape of the rivers changed, because with vegetation, the riverbank would not erode or break down as easily, and of course, the beavers, fish, birds, and other animals were able to return.
And all was well. Moral of the story, certain species might be more valuable than you think, and we don't want to find out when it's too late.
Also, the lack of biodiversity can create some direct risk for our food systems. An example would be the famous potato famine in Ireland. If we have a certain food plant like potatoes and they're essentially clones of each other or generally really similar genetically, one disease like the potato blight might be able to destroy them all. But you have many more variety, at least some are likely to be resistant to that disease.
And what about the organisms that have medical properties? For example, many rainforest plants. Believe us, there are many of those. And it would suck if they were wiped out before we even had the chance to study them. And now that we can agree that biodiversity is something we want to keep around, let's talk about biodiversity conservation.
This overlaps a bit with our next episode, but having some native plants in your yard is great for pollinators, and the plants, of course, also provide diversity as such. You can also create some nesting places for birds or ponds that benefit a variety of animals, but make sure you follow proper instructions so you do not cause more harm than good. These are ways to promote biodiversity in your immediate environment.
And take a look at your consumption habits. You can buy some certified organic food if your budget allows. Organic farmers are required to promote biodiversity, and they are a great contrast to the conventional way of farming, also called monoculture, as organic farmers often grow a variety of species in one spot.
Organic farmers must use less pesticides, thus being more gentle to local wildlife, and they use more natural crop protection methods instead. In general, they make more uses of existing natural processes instead of creating new artificial ones. Also, organic farming uses less nitrogen for fertilization, and too much nitrogen in the environment causes biodiversity loss. There are also versions of farming that protect biodiversity, like permaculture and agroecology, but organic farming is, of course, most well known.
Lastly, we are going to say something that not everybody wants to hear, but many of you probably already know. In my opinion, the best thing you can do for biodiversity is to eat less animal products. Animal farming takes up so much space right now, almost 80% of the existing farmland, to be more specific. And yet it produces less than 20% of the global calorie supply. That is super duper inefficient use of land. If we can reduce that, there is more space for natural ecosystems and biodiversity can thrive.
So my friends, eat some veggies and make space for some forest. We are going to talk about sustainable diet in the future, but this was too important to leave out from biodiversity conservation.
Okay, that was all we had to say about biodiversity today. We discussed 3 types of biodiversity we should care about. Then we discussed what ecosystem services are and why we would like to keep them. And we also went through main threats to biodiversity. Finally, we had some concrete examples of what biodiversity destruction can mean, and also some advice on how to protect biodiversity.
But hey, don't go just yet. We still have one more segment planned for you. So basically, this podcast has been kind of taking the viewpoint of a student or someone in the academia, but we wanted to show you that there are actually a lot of people in the university that take action also in their free time. So it's not just studying and reading books, etc. So we have here Bobbi from Extinction Rebellion, and she will tell us a little bit about herself and what she does.
Hello, Bobbi. So we have heard that you're part of the Extinction Rebellion, and we were wondering if you could explain a little bit about what the movement is.
Sure. So Extinction Rebellion is a quite recently emerged global movement for activism for climate and biodiversity. So we're really advocating for politics to take action and to be honest about the climate crisis and to do what's necessary to kind of reverse the effects or try to mitigate the effects. And Extinction Rebellion is active quite well everywhere, all over the world. You have a lot of different national organizations, and those are split up again in local organizations. So in the Netherlands, we have a lot of sub-movements, quite for a lot of cities, and I am involved in the one in Rotterdam.
All right, could you tell us a little bit what it is exactly that you do in the Extinction Rebellion Rotterdam?
So just like the movement is split up in local groups, the local groups are then again split up in kind of subgroups that treat specific topics that are necessary for the movement. So we, for example, have an art circle that thinks of artistic actions to hold or that makes art or artsy signs to use during actions. We have a politics team that focuses more on the political side of everything and really tries to influence political parties or political strategies. And I am involved in the media and communication circle. We call those team circles, by the way. Sorry if that's confusing. But the media and communication circle treats everything that has to do with media and communication. So we manage the social media, we reach out to press and make sure that all of our actions are well covered. We keep track of the photographers and make photo selections. So you're really just a content strategist or media person, just like what people do for actual companies, but then for a non-profit movement.
That is really cool, and I'm very sure that you have a lot of favorite memories or a lot of memories that you think are amazing from your time in the media and communication department, but maybe you could share one of your most favorite stories.
Sure. Well, I've only been involved for a year, but we have had so many actions that I've quite had a lot of favorite events / experiences already. But surely one of my favorites is from our September Rebellion. So a rebellion is something that we hold every half year in which we kind of have a lot of actions going on in a single period of time, maybe even in one location or focused on one strategy or topic. And in the September Rebellion, we had a back office for media, and it was actually in the Greenpeace headquarters. So I kind of got to work in the Greenpeace headquarters, sit at an actual Greenpeace desk, go to the Greenpeace toilets. It was so awesome. So that's one of my favorites, but also just being involved in the actual actions, because working from the back office is cool, but kind of experiencing the entire thing and being part of it is really nice as well. So we recently had an action in Rotterdam in which we blocked some streets and we ended the action on top of the Erasmus Bridge. And it was just great to have all these people engaged for climate on top of a bridge, blocking a bridge, chanting cool things. So that was great. So that's my second favorite.
Wow, this was so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And now that it's almost the end of the segment, do you want to say one last word to our listeners? Something that you really want to take out from your system?
Nice. Yeah. So I think the reason why I joined Extinction Rebellion is because, I really believe in tackling the system from inside. So maybe through academia or being involved in politics. But it's also just really nice to do some activism, right? And just let your voice be heard. So if you maybe want to do something like this as well, it's great to join. Also, because it's not all about being there at the actual actions. There are quite a lot of supporting roles, like doing arts, like doing media, for which you don't actually have to be on location. So that might be nice to consider if you like to be part of something, but don't like to be part of the heart of the action. So that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
hashtag join Extinction Rebellion.
All right.
Alright.
Thank you for coming. And I'm sure our listeners will find your stories really interesting. It is something really different than we usually go through in this podcast. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us today. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed this episode and will join us next time too. Please stay tuned for future episodes, especially the next episode when we talk about bees, polar bears, and whales.
Also, if you guys have something that you would like to talk to us about, or maybe you have an idea for a fun segment for us, please contact us. We would love to hear from you. You can do that on our personal Instagrams, if that is where you found this podcast, but you can also do that on email, 4600podcast@gmail.com. Bye!
Bye!
And special thanks to MS Teams for making this podcast possible.
Dropped out of the meeting.
What?
She dropped out of the meeting.
Are you still here, Bobbi?